talking a little bit about the music of Hans Gall, who is an Austrian-born composer. He lived from 1890 to 1987. I hope to give you a little glimpse today into his very unique musical language and some of his ways in which he differentiated himself from other composers during that time period. Although he's not as widely known as some of his contemporaries, Gall occupies a really fascinating position in 20th century music history. Despite not being widely recognized today, Gall developed a very distinct and consistent musical voice by around the early 1920s, still rooted in the Austro-German tradition, and combines a sort of Schubert-like lyricism with Bach-inspired counterpoint, and synthesizes this all with an 18th century kind of classical clarity and balance, while continuing to write in an extended tonal language, even as many of his contemporaries were moving away from tonality. Although you might not have heard of a lot of his pieces, he published over 150 works, including 4 full operas, 4 symphonies, 4 string quartets, 2 large-scale cantatas with an orchestra, numerous orchestral and chamber works, and a complete set of 24 preludes and 24 fugues for piano, one in each key, and a whole boatload of vocal music on the end of that. And much of that became largely forgotten due to the turmoil that surrounded his life during the World Wars. He was trained in Vienna in a time when late Romanticism was kind of the dominant musical sphere, and he lived through a period of enormous upheaval in both the musical scene and also the political scene. Well, a lot of composers around him were pushing more towards atonality and serialism and other forms of more radical musical experimentation. Gall was choosing a little bit of a different way to differentiate himself. His music remains rooted in tonality, clarity, and traditional forms, even as the world around him is changing dramatically. And in fact, one of the most important things that we'll look at is not how much his style changes, but how much it doesn't and stays very consistent. So the central idea that I want to explore a little bit today is how Hans Gall develops and evolves as a composer without ever abandoning tonal clarity, formal balance, expressive lyricism, all the things that he begins with in his language, even in the face of exile, war, and major stylistic shifts in the era of 20th century music. So to trace that idea, we're going to move through several stages of his career, a little bit of a chronological overview of his life, take some samples musically from different time periods, beginning with his early works in Vienna, where we hear him forming his voice within the late Romantic tradition. Gall's early musical life was deeply shaped by Vienna, which was at the time and had been for many years previously one of the most important musical centers in Europe. He studied in the University of Vienna, where he later also taught at a very young age, and was part of a musical culture still strongly connected to composers like Johannes Brahms and Franz Schubert. But unlike a lot of his contemporaries who at this time were beginning to experiment with atonality and really pushing the envelope with the tonal system, Gall was much more interested in refining and continuing the tradition and building something on top of it. He was also pretty cautious early on with his early music. He didn't publish a lot of his earliest works while he was still in this period developing his musical language. But in the pieces that we do see from this time, we can already hear a lot of distinct, defining characteristics of his style, such as some things you'll notice are a strong sense of phrase structure and balance, very clear and functional harmony, and natural lyricism and harmonic writing. There's also a lot of restraint. His textures are very transparent, even when the harmony is rich. Almost in a fashion we'll see is very similar to the classical composers. So what you just heard is from his 3 sketches for piano. It is the second one in those 3 sketches. It was written sometime between 1910 and 1911, coming from what Gall later described as his years of apprenticeship before the First World War. During this time period, he composed a lot of works, including a full opera, several chamber and orchestral works, as well as a full symphony, which is very noteworthy. It won a major state competition in 1915, but a lot of these works were withdrawn or left unpublished or set aside even after performances, including that symphony, which won the award. In some cases, he even replaced completed works with newer ones before they were even performed. And because of this, only a small portion of his earlier works and earlier music survives in the realm of published and official music that he put out. And the three sketches, one of which you just heard, is Opus 7, are among those surviving works. And they're a very important window into his developing musical language at this time. They put him squarely within the late Romantic tradition, while beginning to establish the clarity and lyricism that would define his style throughout his life. The one you just heard was the tempo marking was Lento e Dolce. It has very clear melodies, it's very simplistic and reserved. There's moments of a little bit louder expression, but they get suppressed very quickly. There's a pedal tone that's constantly switching between the tonic and the dominant, which keeps us centered in the key of E flat for the duration of the piece, not really exploring too much outside with different tonalities, except in the little B section, the middle section, that was moving around a little bit and modulates around, breaks free from the harmonic progression, but then it settles back down and pulls back to the tonic key very quickly. So we see Gall here balancing these expressive moments, breaking through with a strong sense of control and tonal clarity. Now, as we move into the 1920s, we'll see an example in which these core traits remain. And one of the most interesting aspects of Gall's style is his relationship with musical tradition. Unlike a lot of 20th century composers, he doesn't necessarily move towards abstraction or a lot of programmatic music, although he did write a lot of operas and all these things. For his instrumental works, and all the ones that you'll hear today, he writes in what we would call absolute music. It's music that's not tied to some external story or image or narrative. The composer's not telling you what to imagine as you are listening, like titling a piece Rainfall, so you think of that. And at the same time, Gall is showing a strong interest in earlier music forms, especially from the Baroque and classical periods. This is something that has been trending around this time in the sort of neoclassicism movements and this return to older structures and reinterpreting them a little bit through modern harmonic language. What's interesting about what Gall does here is it's not imitating the older works of the older, classical periods. He's not trying to recreate the past. He's using them as a sort of framework, something more stable and familiar, from which he can break through and explore more flexible harmony and subtle tonal shifts and throw in a lot of detailed counterpoints, drawing from that. And the next two pieces I'll be playing come from his Opus 24 Suite for Piano, written in 1922. And I'll be playing numbers 4 and 5 from this set, entitled Sarabande, Funebre, and Gigue. Both of these are Baroque dance forms, and they're a great example of Gall's interest in his synthesis of his language with historical structures. The first one you'll hear, the Sarabande, is traditionally a slow, stately dance in a triple meter. And what Gall does here is he keeps the same basic character, but he transforms it into something more somber and reflective. The funebre, or the funeral character, comes in through the weight of his phrasing and the very rich harmonic color, and it's a lot more ambiguous than, of course, anything that you would hear in a traditional Baroque sarabande. There's a very chromatic and dissonant initial theme that you'll hear. It's very restrained. It builds up climaxes, but it's very short in its louder sections, and it always pulls back. One of the really interesting things that you'll hear in that piece as well, that Gall uses a lot here, is the use of the whole tone scale. In this case, it will come in as a unison whole tone scale. And that's something that you would think of Impressionism or the gamelan, something a little more exotic, you could say. And he uses this whole tone scale to build energy. And along with this, he's constantly modulating through this piece. We're constantly in and out of different keys. We're not really centered anywhere necessarily, but it still stays more grounded. It becomes a lot slower and peaceful and accepting before the end, and you'll hear the A theme return at the end, along with some interesting effects. I feel like I hear church bells in there somewhere. And this is really fascinating to me, this piece as a whole, because it's an example of something that I haven't seen very much in Gall's writing in his repertoire. It's something that's a lot heavier. He writes a lot of more lighter classical style, happy pieces that aren't necessarily like these really big, deep, dark, heavy, emotional, weighty songs. And he kind of forgoes that classical lightness here and leans into something a lot darker and more ominous. It's very romantic. It's got these rapid emotional shifts, outbursts, and still stays fairly restrained. In contrast to that piece, the next one that you'll hear is a gigue, which is typically a fast and lively and rhythmically driven dance form. And this movement really highlights, I feel like, Gall's use of counterpoint and motivic development. And while this form is clearly rooted in the Baroque tradition, the harmonic language is, of course, a lot more fluid. You're going to hear shifting tonal centers all over the place, and a lot more modern in the sense of momentum and development, as well as some really, really dense counterpoint that's constantly shifting around and moving us somewhere. There's a more smooth lyrical B section theme that's more expressive, and then the A theme returns in minor, and he plays with all these things together. The B section arrives, and then he mixes in the A theme with the B section, and it's a masterclass in writing this sort of counterpoint synthesis, and a great example of Gall's incredible writing and sense of harmony with these things. So as you listen to these two movements, I would invite you to listen for how Gall balances a historical form, his historical structures, with a modern harmonic voice. He's not abandoning the tradition, he's actively working within it and expanding what it can do. This is Gall's Opus 24, numbers 4 and 5, Sarabande, Funebre, and Gigue. Opus 24, we see Gall engaging with older forms, especially used in the Baroque tradition. And by the time we reach the 1930s, that interest in structure is very much still there. And we'll also see how his writing becomes a little more condensed and character-focused with the examples we'll look at. We'll be looking at his Opus 64, 3 little pieces. These were written in 1933 during Gall's interwar period, and this comes after a really important phase in his life. Before World War I, he had already begun to establish himself as a composer, but the war interrupted that momentum, and he kept composing through it, and in the 1920s his career really took off. He's being performed all across Germany and Austria. He's getting increased recognition, especially for his chamber and vocal music. And by the early 1930s, he is really recognized and respected as a composer. So by 1933, we're hearing a composer who seems to be fully mature stylistically, and his musical language is not just forming, it's very concentrated and controlled. And we're going to look a little bit about his move in some of these pieces towards a little shorter forms and more concentrated musical ideas. The 2 pieces I'll be playing here now, Melody and Scherzino, are good examples of that shift. Instead of being larger scale or historically modeled works, they're little brief character pieces. The titles are very simple, but they point to a specific musical idea or gesture and keep with our theme of absolute music as well. The second one, entitled Melody, centers on a single lyrical idea, but it really has 2 primary melodic lines happening at once. One of them is an 8th note off of the other, off of the beat, and it's usually in a little descending line that kind of works around it. And it starts off underneath, and then about halfway through the piece, all of a sudden it's on top, and the main melody is kind of in the middle of this dense texture that's happening here. And I would invite you to listen for in this piece how the melody is shaped with more small and subtle changes, and how the accompaniment stays more supportive and understated, and reflects that sense of clarity and control that we've been hearing throughout Gall's music. Now the Scherzino is going to be a gigantic jump from that, yet again. A lot of contrast, more light, playful, rhythmically active. The title of Scherzo suggests something like, of course, a joke. Scherzino would be like a little joke. It's more delicate than a full scherzo. It's very fun, bouncy, syncopated rhythm. I really enjoyed learning this piece. It's a lot of fun. And I would invite you to listen for these very quick shifts in character, and it's very quiet. It's sitting at a pianissimo for most of the piece. And there's these it has a lot of energy, but it's very compressed. And it has a trio section in the middle, takes the theme, makes it a little bit more contemplative and slower, while still keeping that light and playful character. And even here, everything is very precise and contained with his writing. It's also worth noting that 1933 marks the beginning of a major political change in Germany, and very soon after this, Gall's career will be disrupted again, this time much more permanently. But in these pieces, we don't hear any of that outwardly yet, and instead the music remains very focused, controlled, and internally expressive. So as you listen, notice how Gall creates a very distinct character and expression within a very small space, and how everything is a little more compressed, but nothing feels incomplete. This is Hans Gall's Opus 64, numbers 2 and 3, Melody and Scherzino. we've seen a composer whose style is remarkably consistent. And even as forms are changing from larger structures and shorter character pieces, things like this, the underlying tonal language and the clarity and tonality and control remains. But historically, we're now approaching a gigantic turning point in his life. In 1938, following the rise of the Nazis, Gigue, who is of Jewish heritage, was forced to flee Austria. He emigrated to the United Kingdom, where he would spend the rest of his life. And this was, as you can imagine, a very abrupt and devastating disruption in his career. He had recently been appointed to the Mainz Conservatory, during which he enjoyed some of the most prosperous, what he described as the most prosperous and happiest years of his life, which of course he lost this position. His works, many of the most popular ones that put him into the spotlight, were performed in German, operas, vocal music, and such, and they would no longer be performed in German-speaking countries. So he had to rebuild his career from scratch in a new country that had never really heard of him, in a language in which the majority of his repertoire was not written for. And like many immigrant composers, he initially struggled to reestablish himself professionally. And what's interesting, though, is that this upheaval in his life doesn't lead to some radical break in his musical language, or writing more in the romantic style of pouring the person and the emotion out into the music. He doesn't suddenly adopt a new style or abandon tonality, forsake it forever. Instead, he keeps refining his style, the same thing he'd been doing, and composing for a wide variety of instruments. So rather than changing direction, his style gets more expansive with the same chord language. One important little brief example from this period in which he wrote is the Symphony No. 2, which is a fantastic symphony, and I would recommend you all listen to it. It's great. This was written after his emigration, and it reflects this larger scale, this very rich orchestration, more extended forms, and this huge emotional range, while still maintaining the characteristic clarity and tonal grounding of his style. Now the next piece that you'll hear, the final one for tonight, is from this later period, the Saxophone Suite, Opus 102B. It was written in 1949, and this is a great example of Gall's expanded instrumental writing. The choice of saxophone is very interesting. The original piece is written for orchestra and viola or saxophone, or piano, viola or saxophone. But the saxophone is not something that you would traditionally see played in anything related to classical repertoire or classic romantic era repertoire either. It's not associated in any way with the traditional Austro-German classical repertoire that we see Gall basing a lot of his works off of, or structuring them off of. But rather than treating it as something exotic or outside of the tradition, Gall integrates the saxophone seamlessly into his musical language, as you will see. He treats it in a very classically grounded way. So we'll be hearing the first movement tonight. In this first movement, I would invite you to listen for the balance between lyricism and structure, and how the saxophone line unfolds in a very vocal kind of singing style. Remember, he wrote a lot of vocal music, and one of his main pieces that he works on in his works is having a very clear lyrical melody. And also how the harmony supports without being overly dense, but still there's a lot of rich, lovely chords in this piece. You also hear a sense of expansion, this broad expressive range, and more flexibility in the pacing and development, all while hearing the tonal language consistent and characteristic of Gall. So as you listen, notice how Gall's core musical voice remains intact, but at the same time, the scale and expressive range feels broader and more open. And at this time, I'd like to welcome our guest artist. He is the saxophonist for the William & Mary Wind Ensemble, William & Mary Jazz Combo, Jazz Ensemble, the Symphony Orchestra and saxophone player as well, also a member of the William & Mary Latin Band, and also the current director of the student-led organization, jazz organization, Wham Band, Big Band, and Little Band. That is my good friend and roommate, Antonio Tsompanidis. Thank you all so much. So a couple of words in conclusion. Across all these works, from his early piano pieces through the interwar years into his later music, you see a composer whose style is very consistent. And while a lot of other 20th century composers were moving towards atonality and experimentation, Gall remained committed to tonality, clarity of form, and lyric expressive writing. And that consistency doesn't mean that his music is static. It's evolving gradually, becoming more refined, more concentrated, and later more expansive. His later works, especially pieces like the 24 Fugues and 24 Preludes, which are very, very impressive, show a very deep engagement with these historical models. He wrote the 24 Preludes in the style after Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, in which he wrote a piece in every single key, so you could test to see if your piano's in tune or not. And he did this as well, wrote one per day during a hospital stay, actually, just to keep his skills sharp. Amazing. And he combines all these things with flexible, modern, harmonic language, and gives a real sense of mastery within the tradition. Later in his life, he continued to compose with the same sense of craft, balance, and clarity that we hear in his earliest surviving works. And rather than breaking away from tradition, Gall's music shows us what it means to remain within it and still grow. And ultimately, Gall's work stands as a testament to the enduring possibilities of tonal music during the 20th century. Thank you all for coming out tonight.